Next, I'd like to introduce our guest presenter. Thomas Crawley is an advanced gardener in the Gardens and Grounds team at the U.S. Botanic Garden. He is responsible for designing and maintaining the U.S. Botanic Garden's kitchen garden, which he helped to establish in 2016 during the renovation of Bartholdi Fountain and Gardens. Thomas is one of the garden's resident experts on vegetable gardening, and we are thrilled to have him back here with us today. Welcome, Thomas.
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking some time to talk with us today about the kitchen garden and answer people's questions. The last time you joined us for a Q&A was early spring, I think March. So a lot has changed out in the kitchen garden since then. And I'm going to pull up a few photos that you sent me so people can see some of the progress. Okay, so the first one I think is a current snapshot of some plants in the kitchen garden. Can you tell us what we're seeing here?
Yeah, this collection of pictures is meant to show the transition the garden is going through right now. So there are still some spring crops that will be harvested soon, but we also have our summer crops that have recently gone in and are continually being added. So at the top left, we have some garlic, and I think that is that lacinato kale there to the right of that? And, oh, tomatoes. Yeah, some tomatoes there, potatoes. Then down in the next row, you see the artichokes. We let them bloom this year. They smell great. Oh, and there's the lacinato kale. I think that must be, that's Swiss chard above the kale. And we have our flower bed. We have some fennel, bulb fennel. We have some red board kale. Looks like oats. And there's wheat and Chinese cabbage.
Beautiful. A lot of people have been commenting on how beautiful those artichokes are. They're very cool to see. Yeah. The next one I wanted to show is sort of this then and now perspective. I think this one you sent me was from early May. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
we kind of just started getting the spring stuff established.
Right. So then if people notice the kale that's over there in the left-hand side of the photo, here's another one that's from this week. So you notice it's gotten a lot bigger.
Despite the really dry spring, we were able to get a really nice crop of cole crops this year. A little bit of supplemental watering.
And then you've gotten to the point now where you've been needing to start harvesting a lot of the things to make room for summer crops.
Yeah.
So here's one. Harvesting a lot of cabbage. And we've now got a pretty good system in place for making sure the produce gets distributed through local food rescue organization, which has been great. So this is one of our first harvests. And then once those crops come out, now you're in the process kind of rotating in a lot of those warm weather crops. And so I wondered if you wanted to just kind of start by talking a little about crop rotation and how you make decisions about that. And maybe we just start with what is crop rotation?
Yeah, sure. Crop rotation is moving out, making sure you don't plant the same thing twice in an area over the seasons. That's the most simplistic way to go about it. So if you plant tomatoes in one spot one summer, you want to make sure you don't plant your tomatoes in that same spot the next summer. That's just baseline. As things get more, I don't want to say complicated, but as they become more complex, you want to make sure you keep members of the same plant family out of the same area. So we're trying to rotate now, trying to make sure we keep all of our nightshades, which would be tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes, tomatillos. We try to make sure we don't plant any member of that family in the same spot. And in addition to not planting it the next year, we try to keep a 4-year rotation in. So no members of the nightshade family or Solanaceae would be planted in that same spot over the course of 4 years. So if you see the diagram on the screen there, we have things divided up by plant family, and we're basically just rotating through the beds as the seasons progress. So if tomatoes go in the upper left-hand section, in the one summer, then they move to the next section the next summer, and so on. And everything kind of makes a conga line with the nightshades and moves around the circle. And that by doing that, you avoid a lot of issues that you might have with diseases, pests. You kind of stay one step ahead of insects that might try to hang out and wait for the next batch of the meal they like to come in. So staying ahead of them and making sure any potential soil pathogens aren't lingering in the soil, ready to attack the next crop that goes in.
Thanks. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about your process for keeping track of what you plant in each bed each season? I know you don't love to have a spreadsheet. So what do you do?
Yeah, I do see the value in spreadsheets, but it's just not really how my brain works. So whenever I sketch out the garden design for the year, I just try to make sure I keep a record of that. And so I can go back and look and see where things were planted and make sure I don't repeat that. And so that's a process I went through when things were more geared towards more aesthetics. We always keep aesthetics in mind, but we are trying to be more strict about our rotations. So it still works out well, but it's not as imperative. I just have to make sure I know which family was in the bed, and that's all reported and registered in my notebooks and on my computer.
Great, thanks. And then the next thing we wanted to quickly touch on before we get to questions, now that summer is here, is irrigation. So probably a lot of people ask you, how often do I need to water? What's your response to that?
I guess my initial response is it depends. It really depends on what you're growing, and it really depends on the type of soil you have. I was just speaking to a fellow from Georgia in the garden this morning, and he was telling me about his red clay there. And once the moisture does penetrate, it's going to hold there for a while. So if you have loamy soils like we do in the garden here, on a hot summer with no rain, we normally, as long as everything is mulched, we're around maybe twice a week. And that's us. So if you have really sandy soils, you might end up watering a lot more since the soil's not going to hold on to the moisture. It's really just important to either dig down an inch or two and see how moist the soil is there. Or if you're more technically inclined, there's a variety of moisture meters you can use to find the field capacity of your soils and figure out when you need to water, when the plants get to the wilt point. But usually sticking your finger in, checking out how moist it is a couple inches down, will do the trick. And keeping mulches on top of your garden will really help reduce how often you need to water.
Great, thanks. And then are there certain types of irrigation that you recommend that you use?
Yeah, overhead sprinklers are great. They're fine. They're easy to set up, either the oscillating type that you find in the stores or the impact sprinklers like you see here. Those can cover a large area and you can adjust how the water fans out. So the setup is really easy on those. That's one good thing about them. But you are going to lose a certain amount of water through evaporation, just the nature of throwing water into the air. The water, it's not the most efficient use of your water. What I've been switching to is drip irrigation, the slide before this one. And basically, it's not super expensive, but it does take a little bit of time to set up. So you're basically just running lines along the rows where you'll be planting. And just make sure you have a pressure regulator on because the water is going to fill up the tubes and then drip out. And it's nice because, oh yeah, you see it here. It's nice because it drips right where the roots are. You just make sure the water goes exactly where it's needed. So as long as everything is lined up nicely, it really isn't, it's really easy to use. And you can add a timer into this. And additionally, like I said, if you have a mulch down, it's just a really efficient way. And once you set it up, a really easy way to water. And it helps you avoid issues with water on the leaves. Like sometimes if you keep water on like your squash leaves, it's going to lead to rot, and you don't want your crops to rot.
Great, thanks. So next we're going to go ahead and transition over to some of the questions that we've gotten so far from participants.
You know, there's one thing I forgot.
One more thing.
I was thinking about it. I was, as far as crop rotation goes, another big reason to rotate your crops is because each plant family is going to pull different nutrients from the soil. So one way that we help maintain our soil vitality, you know, without adding a bunch of extra fertilizer in all the time, is to make sure that when we have a heavy nitrogen user like corn, we follow it up with something that's going to fix nitrogen like beans. Every plant family is going to pull macronutrients and micronutrients from the soil differently. So you can strike a balance where you're making sure the soil isn't completely depleted by moving the crops around. So
great, thanks for adding that. That's important to think about. So we did get a few questions about crop rotation, so maybe we'll start there. Here's one. Someone said they're growing a few different types of vegetables from different families within a 4x8 raised bed. Is it enough to rotate crop location within the bed, or should they avoid planting anything from those families the next year?
So ideally, that's a good question. Ideally, you'll plant in separate beds, separate raised beds. But in lieu of that, yeah, you can definitely rotate. If you have that split up into, say, 4 sections, you can definitely rotate around that bed. And that will provide you some of the same protections and benefits of a bigger crop rotation.
Thanks. And then another one, this person is from Iowa, but applies to all of us. Are there certain vegetables that can be planted twice in a season?
Yeah, there are definitely some that aren't as susceptible to a lot of diseases. Like tomatoes, I probably would not plant tomatoes twice in the same area. But things like legumes, I find I don't have many disease issues in this area with legumes. So I can plant, or I have planted peas in the same area. I think there actually is some benefit to a lot of things, like a lot of plants develop a relationship with the soil mycorrhizae, the funguses in the soil that kind of help each other grow. And so once that network is established, yeah, it should actually be beneficial to plant those. For the most part, though, most of the annual crops, it's better to rotate. And then there are perennial vegetables like asparagus or cardoons, and those are just going to stay put. So, of course, those can stay in the same spot.
Thank you. Here's another one. Is there any lettuces that are more heat tolerant and that can be grown all summer?
Yeah. I'm sorry. No cultivar names come to mind right now. I don't know of any that can be grown all summer in direct sunlight, but there are definitely some more heat-resistant varieties that don't bolt as quickly when the heat hits them. But you know, another thing you can do if you do want to grow your lettuce through the summer is either grow them under a shade crop, sorry, like a shade, grow them under shade, whether that's a shade cloth or like intercrop it between other taller plants. They're not getting as much sunlight, but I've done that in the past and it seems to work pretty well.
Thank you. And then as a follow-up, this person asked, what are the best vegetables for winter months? So if they're thinking ahead for winter, what has worked well for you?
Yeah, it's funny. So I've been growing in DC for a while now, but I lived in Richmond previously. So most of my experiences was with those areas, but I've grown kale through the winter, as long as the low temperatures aren't under 20 and sustained for too long. So kale, collards, Swiss chard, I've grown through the winter. And also there are cover crops that you could plant, like winter wheat or rye. And I've had oats last through the winter here too. But of course, it depends on where you're gardening. Strangely, our artichokes for the last 3 winters have survived. They're supposed to be an annual crop. So in addition to the ones I mentioned, I wholeheartedly recommend experimenting. You never know what the winter is going to be like around here. So some things will get through the winter that you wouldn't normally see getting through the winter. And also, I should mention with season extension, like using a cover, a cloche, or a cold frame, you can grow a lot of things that would prefer growing in the fall or spring deep into the winter, even if you can't grow them all the way through the winter. Like if you have your lettuces or I guess a lot of leafy greens. Lettuce is the first one that comes to mind. If you have those growing under cover, they should grow well into the winter, as long as they're getting some residual heat.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked, which starter vegetables would you recommend to grow for beginners?
That's another great question that I answered this morning. The 2 that I recommended were lettuce and radishes. Lettuces are great because you can just kind of toss the seed. You don't even have to cover it. And within a week or so, as long as you keep the soil moist, you should see them come up. And you don't have to worry about figuring out how to prepare it. You can just grow it and eat it. And radishes are great because within a month, you can harvest them. The seeds pop up within a few days, and or they germinate within a few days, and then you can pull them from 30 to 60 days and have your radishes ready to go. So I'd recommend both of those.
Thank you. We have a few different soil questions, so maybe we'll go into those.
I'll try.
The first one says, I added too much worm castings to my 2.5 foot by 7 foot raised vegetable garden, and all the vegetables died. I would like to plant more vegetables using the same plot. What should I be adding to the existing garden soil to offset the worm casting so that the new vegetables will do okay?
Well, I guess that would depend on a couple things. It would depend on whether or not the castings were tilled into the soil, or if you used it as a top dressing. If you use it as a top dressing, I would recommend just taking off a couple inches, see if that works. And as far as that being the reason the crop failed, I really feel like I'd have to get a little more information to know all the factors involved. But if you're not a stickler for using only on-site growing substrates, you could always just bring in some garden soil and mix it with your castings and see if that helps. I'm assuming maybe it adjusted the pH to the point where the plants weren't happy, maybe something like that. With that said, I'd probably get a soil test. That'd probably be the best place to start and see. If it's just a matter of the pH needing to be adjusted one way or the other, then you would add either sulfur or lime, depending on which way you wanted it to go. But I think that will probably be the first step, is getting a soil test to see what's going on.
Thanks. And then you had mentioned different crop families using different nutrients. And so do you have any advice on amending soil to account for nutrient use after growing vegetables? Is it more effective to use fertilizer or grow nitrogen fixing cover crops in between? The person asked.
So that's another case where if you're just starting out with a plot and you really want to know, either a store-bought soil test or sending it off to the local land-grant university to see what's in it. But in lieu of that, I've done both. I've added organic low nitrogen fertilizers with an assortment of macro and micronutrients in it to the soil just between plantings. But additionally, I've grown legumes, like just planted peas throughout the garden in an attempt to fix soil, fix nitrogen in the soil. But it's funny, I sound like a broken record, but I think a soil test is, if you're concerned about your nitrogen, the amount of nitrogen in your soil, then a soil test is the best way to go.
Thanks. Any advice for gardeners with clay soil?
That's always the question. My sister lives outside of Atlanta, and she has a lot of red clay. And I suggested to her to top dress it with leaf compost, and hopefully just build up the topsoil. I think it's difficult to change the makeup of the soil itself, like the subsoils. So I mean, you could till in maybe the first 2 or 3 inches. You could till in some organic matter, but even then, I would still top dress it with some organic matter like leaf compost or other compost, and that way, through leaching, the good stuff will get down into the soil and hopefully help things grow. Definitely don't add sand. I know in the past, a lot of people thought, well, there's clay and there's sand. If I have too much clay, I should add sand. That's just going to give you cement, basically. So organic matter is the way to go, whether you till it in the first couple inches or top dress it. If you do decide to till it in, though, make sure it's fully composted. You don't want leaf mulch in there competing with the microbes on the leaf mulch, competing for the nitrogen with the plants. So if you do till it in, make sure it's composted. But if you want to use uncomposted leaf grow or something like that, you can just top dress it. Hope that answers the question. It's clay is kind of tough. And additionally, I would say grow what does well in your soils. Like you're probably not going to want to grow carrots if you have clay soil. You're going to have a rough time. But things like okra, I think a lot of members of the nightshade family like tomatoes and eggplants. They should do okay with a little bit of amendment to the soil. So there's probably going to be some things you're just not going to be able to grow efficiently without a lot of additions to the soil. So that's how I would start growing with things that do well there.
Thanks. And then someone just asked, have you heard of using daikon radishes to repair and amend soil? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I tried that in previous seasons. And so I think there's a couple schools of thought. I think the idea is you plant the cover crop, you let the roots, they go pretty deep, and then you till them under. I actually harvested the daikons that we grew, but I had one that was probably 18 inches. So they did do a good job of getting deep down into the soils and kind of opening up some channels. So yeah, that's oilseed radishes. I know I've been on some boards where I've seen farmers kind of argue back and forth about whether it's worth it for them to invest in the seed to plant the oilseed radishes, but for smaller areas, yeah, I think it's definitely worth it. And if you choose to harvest them, that's totally up to you. You'll still get some of the benefits of the root growth.
Thanks. All right, we've got a set of pest questions. Want to go to pest questions?
Okay, sure.
This person said, I've had an issue with small green worms destroying my Brussels sprouts the last 2 years. I tried sprays and row cover protection. I hear that sometimes you have to leave a crop out for a year or two in order to rid your soil of certain pests. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it sounds like you're either talking about cabbage loopers or cabbage worms. It's a tough one. If you have a small enough plot, I just look out for the first little indication of a hole, and then I look for the worm and I sweep it off. And if you have a small enough area, you can kind of just go through every week or so and do that. But if you don't have time for that, once you start noticing damage, you can do a mixture of either a horticultural soap, or you can use dish soap, a low pH or a neutral pH dish soap to smother them. So you would just mix it with water. I'm sorry, I don't have the ratio off the top of my head, but you can look it up. This soap will actually get rid of the worms, to use a kind term. And there's another product that uses the active ingredient in neem oil. It's like a natural insecticide. I don't know if I should mention name brands here, but I'll say it's the active ingredient in neem oil, or neem oil itself is good also for smothering those sorts of pests. But yeah, in lieu of picking them off with your fingers or blasting them off with water, any of those things should work. And they usually just go for the tender leaves in the middle, so you can usually get away with just treating those. But also rotating your crops will hopefully help alleviate that a bit. The butterflies won't know where to land from year to year.
Great. And so someone else asked about squash bugs and vine borers. Do you have suggestions? Would you use similar techniques or something else? They said they did start under a row cover.
Yeah, it's a shame because row covers are one of the best ways of avoiding that, but things do get under them and through them, or rather under them. That hasn't been an issue for me. I haven't had to deal with them personally, but yeah, as far as maintaining your garden organically, yeah, those two methods should work. The soaps and oils are pretty universal in smothering insects. So just make sure there aren't too many, hopefully no beneficials there that also get smothered. But yeah, soaps and oils applied at the right ratios and at the right time can do everything you need.
So we have a lot of tomato questions. People love to talk about tomatoes. Here's one. You said you lived in Richmond. Can Hanover tomatoes be grown in DC or Maryland?
I haven't had any issues growing any type of tomato here, as long as the soil is right. Or actually not, I mean, I've grown them in clay soils. I've grown them in sandy and loamy soils. It's just really as long as the soil chemistry is right. So there's a number of organic and non-organic, if that's your choice, tomato fertilizers that have specifically what tomatoes need to grow. So if you want to use that instead of your own compost, you can. But yeah, there's at least, I don't know that I have grown Hanover tomatoes specifically up here, but I've grown about 12 varieties of tomatoes up here and all did well.
Great. And then you addressed it a little bit, but somebody asked just sort of what are your general tips for growing great tomatoes? And then they also asked with that, are there companion plants that you would recommend with tomatoes?
Yeah, I understand. I don't do a lot of companion planting stuff, but I understand that basil is a good one to grow with tomatoes, and also carrots. So folks who swear by companion planting, those are two that they mention a lot. And anything like marigolds, anything that would keep a would-be tomato eater that's not a member of your family out of your garden is also a good companion plant. As far as advice about how to grow good tomatoes, just make sure it's never in need of water. Like, if you have a plant that is constantly flagging, eventually that's going to catch up with you and you're not going to get a good crop of tomatoes. So I try to keep the watering regular. It doesn't have to be every day, but just keep it regular and make sure it doesn't stay wet, but make sure it doesn't stay dry for too long. That's kind of baseline advice. Otherwise, just rotate your crops. Make sure you're not growing tomatoes in the same place twice in 2 seasons, and just give it what it needs, whether you're crushing up your own eggshells or applying fertilizer to it. That's kind of a lot of people, I don't usually get into this, but a lot of people swear by pruning their tomatoes. So you can get more fruit if you're pruning out, like, there's kind of a Y that forms where the offshoots grow from the main stem. And then there's often a second stem that starts to grow between those two. If you cut that and just kind of keep it growing straight and not all over the place, a lot of folks swear by getting more fruit production by not dedicating so much energy to leaf growth.
Thanks. And you mentioned eggshells, so somebody did ask about that specifically. And they asked, how can I add calcium? I heard crushed eggshells, but I also heard that takes forever and they have tomatoes.
Yeah, making that stuff available is a long process. Fertilizer usually isn't taken right up. or at least if it's not bioavailable, it's not taken right up. But as far as the eggshells go, I think having more surface area exposed is probably helpful. So one thing I've done is make sure I bake the eggshells at a low temperature in the oven, and then I throw them in the blender. I don't do this often, but I have done it before. It's kind of as an experiment. And then blend them up in the blender for a really fine powder, and then apply that. And I would think that having more surface area exposed, it would become bioavailable more quickly in the soil. So you can see, you can try. I feel like my results were mixed. I had a good batch of tomatoes, but they weren't better than previous batches of tomatoes. But if you're lacking in calcium, I'd definitely recommend that.
Interesting, thanks. Someone said, I bought a Better Boy tomato that was meant to be planted in the ground. If I pot it on my balcony instead, will it grow? Do you have any tips for turning a garden tomato plant into a balcony tomato plant?
Yeah, I actually ran out of space in my home garden this year, and I ended up planting a tomato in a large pot I had that a tree came out of. So I think the only issues you're going to run into is that they can get pretty big. I don't remember if Better Boy is indeterminate growth or determinate, but regardless, it's going to get pretty big, and it's probably going to need water pretty often. So you're going to have to keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't dry out. Otherwise, there are no issues with growing what you would normally grow on the ground in a container.
Thanks. Someone asked, my tomatoes have set quite a bit of fruit, but it doesn't seem to be ripening. Any advice for encouraging that?
One thing a lot of folks swear by is trying to think of the term, gleaning maybe, or culling. You actually, if there are larger tomatoes that you're growing, like beefsteak tomatoes, just making sure that you're not trying to grow 10 tomatoes on one plant at a time, like actually going through and finding the biggest, healthiest ones and then taking out the smaller ones so that all the energy is diverted to those. You can try that. But I know phosphorus is something that plants like when they're flowering or when they're making fruit. So I don't know if you'd be able to get that in the ground and in the plant in time for these fruits, but adding some sort of tomato fertilizer with a bit of phosphorus in it, not too much, but a bit might help things along for the next batch. But yeah, I would go through and take out any extra fruit. Like if you have 10, take out maybe 4 or 5 of them.
Thanks. Someone wanted to follow up on your eggshells. They wanted to know, why do you bake them before putting them in the blender?
That is just about, they had raw eggs in them. So you don't want to make sure you don't contaminate your crops with any potential salmonella or whatever might be in a raw egg. Hopefully that's not in your eggs, but just to be doubly sure, that's why I do it, or did it rather.
Somebody just asked, there are varying thoughts out there on the use of Epsom salt in the garden. What is your opinion on it?
Just my opinion. You won't judge me for having an opinion.
That's what they asked.
I think it's the magnesium content that people are going for with the Epsom salt. I think there are other ways to get that. I personally haven't used Epsom salt. I'm sure it probably works to some degree, but yeah, I don't use it personally. I don't normally recommend it, but I wouldn't say it's bad. But since it's for the magnesium, I would normally just recommend a pre-mixed organic fertilizer with magnesium in it.
Thanks. Somebody asked, how do you know when to harvest garlic?
That's a good question. The garlic, I'll give you 2 answers. Sometimes I do things differently at home than I do here. At home, I usually wait until the leaves are falling over and yellowing, and then I harvest them. But a more, I guess, accurate way of doing it is you'll notice that the garlic sends up a scape, or it sends up a flower. And before the flower opens, you can actually harvest that and use it in cooking. But I think it's about 3 weeks after it sends up that first flower, that's when you can harvest it.
Thanks.
And sorry. I'm just thinking when it sends up a flower, that's usually going to be indication that the foliage is going to start to die back. So I guess it's really the same thing. I'm just doing it later in the process when I'm harvesting it at home, once they start to yellow. But yeah, 3 weeks after the flowers sends up should be good. But you can also pull one up and check it. I like to do that too. Plant enough that you can have one as a tester.
Right. So we're almost at the end of our time. So I'll ask you one more question. We'll end with sort of a forward-looking question. We're looking ahead to DC in July and August. What are you going to be doing to keep your garden hydrated and surviving the summer heat?
I'm going to install some more drip line because, like I said, that's the most efficient way of distributing water. I'm also going to make sure that my pine mulch is as thick as it can be without inviting any residents, small furry residents. And usually when you keep it under 3 inches, that is a good way to make sure they don't burrow in there. So about 2 inches of pine straw to keep the water in. And otherwise, I'll just be monitoring the soil and making sure things aren't too dry.
Thanks. Great advice. We really appreciate you being here with us today, sharing your expertise with us. And we appreciate all the great questions from our program participants today. So thanks everybody for being here.